It says the session is being recorded. Good morning.
Morning.
If you don't answer, I'll do it again. Good morning.
Morning.
All right. Good morning. My name is Tom Scott, and I'd like to welcome everybody to today's lecture series. This lecture series is part of the University of South Carolina's iTech 493 Information Security for Managers class, and we have designated Fridays as part of our guest lecture series. So this is the second week that we have conducted this lecture series. Last week we did a presentation on ransomware and law firms, and this week we're going to hear from a security professional, my colleague Charlie Mauney. I could do a bad job of messing up his introduction, so I'll go ahead and give him the opportunity to do that. I'm going to turn the podium over to Charlie, and I will manage the webinar from there. Anyone that has questions on the webinar, you can send them in via chat. We will try and answer those at the end of the class. And obviously, anyone here in the physical classroom, at whatever point that Charlie's taking questions, then you guys can ask questions there. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the podium over to Charlie and get started. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate you guys having me this morning. I will attempt to do a decent job on my own bio. I think I know that pretty well. But it's an exciting time for you guys. It's a great time to get into this field. I'll give you a little bit of a chronology. Well, I'm trying to switch it. There we go. So I'm a graduate of the school that's on the webcam there. Don't tell President Clements that I'm not having a Solid Orange Friday. I didn't think it was appropriate while I was here as a guest on your campus to wear the wrong color on a game day weekend. But I finished school in 1993. I spent a couple of years in the insurance industry prior to getting in the technology industry. I started my technology career here in Columbia, out in Blythewood, a company called Policy Management Systems. If you're driving up 77 towards Charlotte, you'll see a big sign that says DXC Technologies. The headquarters of the DMV is on that campus now, but once upon a time, that was Policy Management Systems. And I started my career there as the youngest salesperson in the history of the company. That makes me now the youngest dinosaur in this industry. So I've been doing this a long time. I'll hit some of the highlights that I saw from when I started to now. And so I started in 1995 covering property and casualty insurance companies and their IT and application solution efforts. So I started right as the preparation and hysteria for Y2K started. And you think of Y2K, well, that happened in the year 2000. Well, most of the planning for Y2K remediation and the work began in the 1997, 98 kind of time frame, so that it would all be done and tested prior to Y2K. So that was a very much a milestone of events that impacted IT. Not long after we rolled out of doing Y2K remediation kind of projects, the internet came along with very good adoption and became less of let's get on AOL and check in with grandma, and started becoming a tool for business. And about that time, I had left PMSC. I spent a little bit of time at a startup. Great experience for me to decide I didn't want to work at a startup very much longer. And so I went to a company out of Armonk, New York called IBM, and I spent 16 years with IBM. I covered the insurance industry primarily for IBM for my first 10 years there. Largely had accounts in the New York metro area right around 9/11. So I saw clients who were very impacted by a severe business interruption that occurred, and how some firms had very good planning around that, on what to do in that kind of scenario, and others had very poor planning around that. And so it gave me a great appreciation for understanding events that could impact your business and how to prepare for that. Around the same time, I started working with companies like USAA, State Farm, Progressive, Allstate, and really how they were trying to utilize technology really to change the way they distributed property and casualty products. Some of them in small ways, some of them in large ways. And the advent of digital technologies and the internet in particular was what drove that. And so they had to not only deal with IT challenges, like how am I going to make my applications available over the internet to both agents and to end consumers, but what is that going to do to my distribution channel? And how is that changing my business? And so we had to walk through a lot of those kind of issues that on the surface seem like, oh, this is an IT challenge, or this is a technology issue, when in reality it was a much more broad business issue that those companies that I had to help them work through. In the 97 time frame, I started leading the IBM team that covered a very large multinational insurer called AIG. You guys probably have seen AIG at a minimum if you're a soccer fan and you've seen it on the Manchester United jerseys. Once upon a time, they were a much larger company than they are now, largely due to the financial crisis of 2008. I was at a funeral for my grandfather. We went to a little town called Carrollton, Georgia on a Friday. At the time, I was covering what was a $140 billion company, and I was not sure they were going to be in business when I came back on Monday. Fortunately, they were. A little bit of a government bailout, selling off some of their assets, becoming very focused on their core business, but they were able to make it through. I had a front row seat to the financial crisis through that role, very intertwined. AIG did a lot of business with IBM. IBM did a lot of business with AIG. The now CEO of IBM was on the board of AIG at the time. I had some meetings with some people who you see on CNBC sometimes that I never thought I would be in the room with during that period. I did not know anyone personally that was portrayed by Steve Carell or anyone in the movie about The Big Short. I didn't know, none of the guilty parties were folks I knew personally that were in that movie. I moved on and decided that I wanted to stick a little closer to home around the 2010 time frame and started calling on companies for IBM's middle market business in North and South Carolina. Decided airline travel was no longer the glamorous life that it once was, and wanted to travel by car. I put the signpost of Blythewood up there in the very beginning because you see a lot of things along my career. I have never left Blythewood or South Carolina. I've traveled a lot. I've had jobs that were in other cities that I commuted to, but I really never left here. So you can have a very storied and diverse career in this industry and never leave South Carolina. Most of my work since coming back here has in one way, shape, or form been driven by the consumerization of IT. And whether that's the impact that that's had on cybersecurity, whether that's the analytics kind of work that you need to do to better understand both your clients and your stakeholders, or whether that's digital experience type work and how you interact with your stakeholders. But last year, about this time, after 16 years at IBM, I decided to take on a new challenge and a great opportunity with a company called Sirius Computer Solutions. And most of my time today is spent either on what is largely under the umbrella of digital transformation, which I do think is a very overused buzzword, so I almost want to slap myself for using it. But really that's about utilizing digital technologies to the greatest extent you can in how it supports your business. Different vendors will show you something and call it digital transformation. None of them are wrong about what where their piece in digital transformation is, but it's very broad and it's not limited to routers or whatever a particular company is trying to sell. And it's really not digital transformation anymore. It's really just transformation. Digital is so embedded in many companies' processes that it's just business transformation. It's doing a little bit differently. But with the digitization of businesses, largely increases the threat from a cybersecurity perspective. So in the old days, if you went to the doctor and your medical record was in paper file, if the network was down, you could get good quality care. In today's age, if the network's down, your medical record is down. If the network's compromised or the databases are compromised, your medical record may be compromised. So it opens up an awful lot of opportunities, but it also opens up a lot of challenges in how you need to protect for that. So you've seen, I've done a lot of things, had a lot of exposure to some of the major events that have kind of shaped IT over the last 22 years. I'm not sure if that makes me the guy from the Dos Equis commercial or Forrest Gump or Uncle Rico from Napoleon Dynamite, but probably seen more than most in the short time that I've been serving this industry. You guys may see something similar, and when you do this 25 years from now, it may be different guideposts along the way, but I in no way think that this has been what will be the most dynamic period of IT, ever in the last 20 years. It'll be a new set of challenges and a new set of opportunities, as there always is, that comes up. I can't move it.
That's right.
Yep. So let me tell you a little bit about Sirius. Sirius is a star. Sirius is a satellite radio company. I don't work for the star or the satellite radio company. So we are largely a VAR and a systems integration firm, if you're familiar with those terms. So we resell other folks' technology and we integrate technology. Some of that is we get from third parties, companies like IBM, Adobe, Cisco, EMC, and a variety of others, as well as we have both infrastructure services practices as well as application services practices. I work specifically with our application services practices. And so we're based in San Antonio, about 4,000 employees, or excuse me, 1,900 employees, 4,000 different technology certifications. So very diverse and very deep at the same time. Our security practice really focuses in a couple of different areas. And so it's very broad. I look after a lot of our security practice with the exception of our network security. We let our network folks kind of be the gurus over there, and my team and we stick around identity and access, data security, SIMs and security analytics, as well as incident response and the services that go around that. We bolstered our security business last year with 2 acquisitions. One we keep as a separate company called Force 3, which does a lot of federal contracting work. So we got to kind of wall that off so that we can ensure we only let people with the right clearances work on those projects. And the other was a company called Continuum out of Omaha, Nebraska, that we really integrated and rolled in to our standard security practices. So today I thought rather, you'll have some folks throughout the series that'll get real deep on certain technology and controls practices. I wanted to give you a little bit of a higher level view at how I have seen my clients over the years really take different security approaches. And there's 4 that I've kind of categorized it in. You could have knocked this down into subsections and maybe done 3 or done 6, but 4 fits really good on the page, and it's a really good way to kind of explain it. The first group of folks still have their head in the sand about cybersecurity, the threats that are out there, the ways to address that threat. And some of that is done knowingly, and some of that is done unknowingly. And we'll talk a little bit about that in depth. The second group of folks that I see are really compliance driven. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the compliance drivers that are there. We'll talk about how that doesn't make you a terrible organization necessarily, because depending on the industry that you're in, the compliance that you have to meet could make you a very robust security organization, depending on what industry you're in and what you've got to protect. And then we'll talk a little bit about folks that take a risk-based approach. And that is very much founded on risk management type principles, and then taking those principles and applying them to cybersecurity and IT risk in general. Don't confuse that with what you may see as a global risk and compliance project or a GRC project at an individual company. Similar, but a little bit different. And GRC projects have gotten a bad name, usually because they're managed poorly, not because the technology doesn't work. And then at the end, we'll talk about the last group, which is really protect the brand. And protecting the brand uses some techniques of the other two, and in particular does take a risk management approach, but takes it in a little bit different manner and starts at a different place. So here's some of the characteristics that are there in each of these groups. So the head in the sand folks, they really, they see security, that's not just another expense to manage in a whole group of expenses that are there. There's not a lot of priority put onto it. They do the minimal level, both in terms of what gets deployed and what gets kind of evaluated. I'm seeing the very siloed solutions with the head in the sand piece, a lot of point solutions. Oh, we've got this problem, or this is a buzzword. Let me go get this taken care of quickly. And then the other thing that you see here in particular on this end, very little corporate-wide security awareness. And so I am sure as students that you guys get a number of things from the university or from James Perry's office about being aware of various security threats that are out there, whether that's social engineering type things or whether that's about good basic hygiene around patching and things of that nature. But folks who have their head in the sand really don't make a good effort to make their organization aware of what threats are and how to mitigate them. A number of security threats that have ended up being pretty big incidents, the cause of them was very small, simple things that could have been fixed. You're seeing less and less of that today than you would have, say, 5 years ago, but it's still a lot of human error. And a lot of that is because people just don't know. They don't know what the risks are. And so, typically on those guys that take that approach, it's let's defend against the known threats, typically in reverse. So a good example of this would have been, and I'm not lumping everybody into this category, but you may have organizations that didn't care about security, and then they turn on NBC Nightly News and they see something called WannaCry. So all of a sudden ransomware is important because I saw it and opened the news last night. And so, but that's a known threat. That's out there. Kind of the horses left the barn at that point before they start worrying about that type thing. Compliance driven, a lot of times that is a checkbox mentality. I've got a certain level of things I've got to do to be compliant, and so I have to make sure I check those boxes because either I won't be allowed to do business or I'm going to face fines, one or the other. It's typically the minimum acceptable level of security controls that the regulations require. Sometimes that's not the case, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the regulations and some of the industries that really have a lot of teeth, where you could be a compliance-driven organization in those industries and have very mature and robust security controls, tooling, and policies. And then in particular with those, anybody that's got critical infrastructure exposure in certain industries, their compliance needs dictate a certain level of sophistication and maturity in IT and in cybersecurity just to meet the compliance. Other industries, not the case. But anything that really has a homeland security direct tie back, their compliance needs are going to be pretty mature in what you've got to adopt to be able to check the box with those guys. Risk-based, fairly holistic view of exposures, controls, and tooling. So instead of looking at things in a vacuum, you're looking a little more broadly at that point. Typically accompanied by an adoption of a security framework of some flavor that's in there, because security frameworks are a great way to organize what you're doing and make sure that you're a little bit thorough in what you're looking at, and you're not just looking at tooling or just looking at policy, that you're looking at it all, from a good lens. And investments are usually made on corporate economics. So any of you guys take any insurance classes here at the university? So risk management number one is kind of, you're balancing the risk versus the cost to protect against the risk. And so, the risks oftentimes can be somewhat infinite. The cost to protect against the risk never is. And so you've got to run into some scenarios where you cannot fund everything. So you've got to do a little bit of prioritization in how you handle those risks and how you address those risks. Protect the brand is very similar to taking a risk. There are some risk management techniques that those folks utilize, but security is really integrated into the growth and profit planning of the firm. So, a little bit different. I'll get into those nuances between the two, but it's highly integrated into how a company does business, rather than, oh, here's my security bolt-on after the fact in the kind of plans we're making. Threats and remediation of incidents are prioritized based on the impact to the bottom line, not necessarily based on ubiquity of the threat or our ability to meet it. It's based on how's this going to impact our business in particular. And then the objective, the incident response and planning and communication planning post-incident is not overlooked by guys who protect the brand, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But the objective is to protect against brand erosion. That a term you guys have heard? No? I was a marketing major, so brand erosion I heard about all the time and continue to. Basically, that means your brand has a value. There's an algorithm to determine your brand's value. And so anything that would diminish the value of that brand, and the value of that brand translates to dollars and cents. And so anything that can erode that brand value needs to be protected against. And some of that are cybersecurity threats. So how do you know? You guys may walk out of here, get your first job. You may have an internship now, and you may wonder, if I had to put these in one of these categories, where's the firm that I'm with now? It could be a commercial firm. It could be a state agency. It could be state and local government. It could be an education group that you're working with. It could be a nonprofit. But how do you know if where you are fits the head in the sand model? One way, and this is not painting everybody with a broad brush, but if security is not broken out at all from the general IT budget, there's probably not enough emphasis put on security and its impact. If it's, I've got a big bucket of IT and whatever's left over, we'll handle some security things, probably not looking at this in the best manner. Tooling is usually limited to foundational capabilities. Some provide limited value in today's environment. There's a big debate now, and I'll let Tom, let an expert talk to this when you get to that subject, but there's a big debate about end-user computing and endpoint protection. And that debate is traditional antivirus software even valuable anymore? You can make the argument that it's not terribly valuable, but at the same time, you can look at some of the bigger breaches and incidents that all they really require, it was a known threat that was out there, and AV may have stopped it. And so my point on that is typically where the head in the sand folks stop their efforts is it's focused around tooling, and it ends up being on what would have been the same security tools most people would have adopted almost 10 years ago. Network protection, AV for endpoint protection, all good technologies, not disparaging them at all, but not particularly holistic in how you look at an organization and how they protect themselves from a defense in depth standpoint. No appreciation for the need for cybersecurity at the board or executive level. That's getting rarer and rarer at medium-sized organizations to large organizations now. But there still are some that their executive team just doesn't understand cybersecurity in general, the threats that it can have to its business, and ways to protect against it, both externally, internally, both with tooling and with controls. And then no clear tie between threats, controls, and tooling, typically in these organizations. If you were to map out the security controls that they have in place, they seem a little bit random. If you were to map out the tooling that organizations like this have, it seems a little random. We've got email protection here, and we've got a little bit of AV, but then all of a sudden we have something very advanced over here in this space because someone saw a magazine article or a very good salesman told them this is exactly what you need. And the reality is they didn't tie it all back together. And so what you end up getting with head in the sand organizations who do have budget to spend, you end up with a kind of a stone soup of tooling that's out there with no real tie back to how is this protecting us holistically. So if you find yourself and you're in one of these, Tom, I can't punch it again. If you're in one of these organizations a year, 5 years from now, if you're one of the folks that are joining us on the WebEx, what do you do? Here's where I am. And I've got a lot of clients who are in organizations like this. You can either improve the organization's situation. I mean, I'll still see Braveheart. That's still coming on cable. Do y'all even have cable, or is that on Netflix?
It always comes on like TNT.
TNT. All right. So a guy named William Wallace led the revolution. And, some great scenes in there about are you going to flee or are you going to stay and fight? And so if you find yourself in that organization, you've got to decide, am I going to make things better here, or at least try to make things better here, or am I going to get my resume on LinkedIn and go somewhere else? I mean, there's really the options you have. It's kind of, most things aren't black and white. If you find yourself as a cybersecurity person in that organization, it is black and white. You either make it better or you go somewhere where it is better. So you improve the organization's situation or you improve yours. So William Wallace had a very famous line. Everybody dies, but not every man really lives. And so you're not necessarily a coward if you leave and go for another organization. That's not what I'm saying at all. But there are ways that you can influence change as a person 1 year out of college at an organization. So the first thing you've got to do is you've got to do your homework. And you can't come in half-baked if you've got a position that you want the company to take. You've got to be very thorough, understand what you're talking about, and be able to explain it. And explain it in two ways. Some people are head people. Some people are heart people. So you've got to know how to position your position to both capture hearts and minds. And how to do that on small ways and in grand ways. Ask good questions. There are no, if you've done your homework and you're asking a question, you're asking it for a reason. And, the thing about asking good questions is getting a broad audience within an organization and understanding the impact at different levels and how things affect them is a great way to ask those questions. When you're making your position or your case, start with why. Always start with why. If it's something that you want to move the needle and move us from point A to point B, people are very rarely interested in how or what if they don't think there's a why to do it. So be very clear, why we're doing this. If you're lower in the organization, find a champion. Find somebody that would have interest in this, that would understand your reason why and why that impacts them and why that would be a good thing for them to help take your case on. I've done that on small cases, and I've done that with the CFO at IBM. And so, sometimes you can't do it alone. And then capitalize on small but impactful wins. I mean, if you try to eat an elephant in one bite, you're going to have a hard time. And people always get behind the winner. But there are more people optimistic about the Gamecock football team this week than last week. You had a win. It's contagious. So let's talk about compliance driven for a little bit. I almost thought about getting a buzzword bingo card going to try and help me from not using so many. But there are a number of regulatory bodies that are out there that monitor different organizations that come up with different regulations that you need to meet. Some of these you guys may be familiar with, others you may not. Everybody in here, everybody's over 18. Everyone has signed a HIPAA form, I guarantee you. You're all students. You probably know about FERPA. I'm a parent of a college student, so I know with FERPA, I can't even get my kids' grades. So I'm not real happy with that part of FERPA. But a number of regulations that are based on individual industries that are in there. So HIPAA and high tech really protect patient data. So if you have any exposure to the healthcare field and medical records, which even can be within an HR organization in a non-healthcare related field, because you may have health insurance data that's out there. And so HR folks in a bank, for example, may have some HIPAA regulations that their data falls under. There's some insurance company regulations that are out there. PCI is about credit card data and protecting that data. So retailers, distribution companies, anybody who takes a credit card in the U.S. is subject to PCI regulations. FERPA, again, is student data. FSMA is some government data that's out there that you've got to protect. NERC and FERC are for energy and utility companies primarily. It's for folks that have nuclear exposure. So you guys all live here, you can't turn on the news without hearing about the Jenkinsville reactors. All of the data that comes out of that nuclear generation facility out there from SCANA or Santee Cooper or Duke Power or whoever's providing power for you, that's all regulated by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And then NERC and SIP is critical infrastructure protection. It's a regulation as well. And so some of these regulations are very broad, very ambiguous, and provide really a guideline to have kind of the lowest common denominator to protect people. NERC and FERC, for example, I have spent 6 years working with SCANA. A lot of my security efforts working with the guys at SCANA in some way, shape, or form are tied back to NERC, SIP type regulatory impositions. SCANA's got a very mature security operation. They've got 30 folks in their SOC, in their Security Operations Center. But a lot of that is really based on the very detailed and robust requirements that are required to meet NERC SIP that are in there. As someone who lives close enough to hear the sirens at Jenkinsville if there were an issue, I'm very happy that there are very strong NERC SIP regulations, because the last thing I want is an incident close enough to my house that I can hear sirens go off. None of us want that. Some industries are real easy about compliance. So if you see the stuff down here at the bottom right hand of this slide, that's called compliance in the box for roofers. So if you buy that box and you utilize all of those, you've met the OSHA requirements for a roofer. Cybersecurity in these industries, not so easy. There is no compliance in a box that you just go out and you order it off the internet and you get compliant. So what do you look for? Kind of similar to the head in the sand. Am I in an organization that's compliance driven? Well, a lot of times the cybersecurity team will have either a solid line or a dotted line to the organization's compliance department. That is a very telltale sign about taking that approach. Most formal security controls in these kind of organizations relate directly back to meeting a specific set of the requirements. We do X, Y, and Z around this control because it's required. If we don't, we're not compliant. And there's some very impactful, sticks and not carrots in that case. Security funding discussions are often framed by avoiding a fine. If we don't do this, A, we can't do business in this particular industry or with this particular entity, or B, we're going to be fined some amount of money for some amount of time until we get compliant. And largely have a prevention focus. Most regulatory impositions around this area are focused on prevention in particular and preventing an incident from happening more so than responding to an incident that has happened. And so when you read through those requirements, a lot of it is about how do I prevent something like this from happening, not how do I deal with it if it does happen. Not the case in all of them, but most of them you look at it, they're very prevention focused. And then you're just as likely to have tools sprawl in a compliance-driven organization than you are to have a lack of tools. And so how you end up with that is Regulation A says we got to do these 3 things. So I'm going to buy the tool to make sure I do these 3 things. Regulation A2 comes out and says, oh, you got to do this 4th thing. Well, you don't go back. Then they end up getting the next tool to do that 4th thing. And so after a while, you end up with sprawl. Is that a term you guys are familiar with, whether it's urban sprawl or just sprawl in general? Not a lot of planning about the growth of something in particular. And so you see that a lot of times. A lot of work I've done in the security space over the last 2 years in particular has been about rationalization, both of controls and of tooling. Where do we have overlap? And we got 4 things, and 3 of them do the same thing, or some flavor of the same thing in a little bit different way. So how do I go back and rationalize that? And so, a lot of times you make a bit of a fallacy and an assumption saying, oh, if somebody's compliance driven, they're not going to be very mature and they're not going to have a lot of tools. Not necessarily the case. So here's some of the reality is compliance-driven organizations can be very mature, depending on the industry. And I can take you to a few industries and you can see it. Folks that do global banking, energy and utilities, we spoke about them. Department of Defense. There are a very number of things that yes, it is compliance-driven, but don't think that it's some simple organization that doesn't understand security, because the genesis of the security efforts came out of compliance. And so anybody that's got big time critical infrastructure, and the way to think about that quite simply is what might be a homeland security issue. What's something you want to protect against a disruption, whether that's a terrorist or whether that's an accident. And so there's a lot of, Tom and I were speaking earlier about some of the critical infrastructure bulletins that have come out that are really about the hurricane. It doesn't have anything to do with a cyber attack, but it's an attack nonetheless on service and trying to respond to a service disruption. Financial services is another one that it's really, the compliance in financial services primarily is driven on size. And so the bigger you are, the more of the controls and tooling that you need to have in place to support those controls. So if you're a small 6-branch bank with only so many customers, you got this level of compliance. If you're Bank of America or Chase or HBSC or people who trade globally, a whole different set of compliance on those folks because the impact's different. Think about how many people bank with Bank of America. If they were to have a breach, well, that's a big time government problem that can disrupt financial systems, much like the subprime mortgage crisis and Brown Brothers and Lehman Brothers and AIG. So there are a lot of things that have been put in place to help prevent against systemic failure, and cyber attacks are something that can cause systemic failure. And compliance in some groups is really just a starting point. You know, we've got folks that started out as compliance-driven organizations that are kind of in the now what stage. So I work with a younger guy, probably late 20s, that I mentor a little bit. He and I have a joint account that we call on, and we've sold him a lot of security technology over the years. They have just scratched the surface on the capability, on utilizing the capabilities of the tooling that they own. And it kind of frustrates him that they don't utilize it to the full capacity. And I have to remind him these were originally bought for a certain function to meet the compliance requirement around that function. They only have so many folks. They only have so many projects that they can do at one time. And so now we're going back and working through and saying, here are the other pieces that you need to take care of. Here are the other controls you need to put in place. Here's how you need to take advantage of what we've already sold you, because you're just scratching the surface. You know, we want you to get the most value out of what you got. So again, don't make the mistake of saying, oh, these guys are just compliance driven. I don't know if I want to go to work there. Because you might. I mean, there's some great employers in that space that are doing some really interesting and fun work in the security space. So let's talk about risk management. Anybody here in a fraternity or a sorority? Risk management probably means something different when you hear it.
Yeah, I mean, it's keeping things under wraps.
I don't know that I would have said that on a recording. I probably would have said, let's make sure we're aware of what's going on and reduce the risk of our members. So I was in a fraternity in the late 80s, early 90s when risk management started getting applied to group life. And so it was a big time change for us compared to you guys who, you know, that's been something that's been around for 20 years now. But basically, it's taking the analysis of the likelihood of the threat against the impact of the threat. So it's very simple math. And I'm sure you guys have figured out how to do matrices like you see down here at the bottom, which is a real simple, you know, risk management model. It says, you know, is this a high likelihood to happen? Is this a low likelihood to happen? If it were to happen, is the impact great? Is the impact low? And then you have kind of a heat map, and it helps you kind of work your way through what controls do we need to put in place, what kind of tooling do we need to have in place on that. When we have an incident, if the likelihood is they've compromised a server that doesn't have anything on it that we care that someone gets, and it has no access to elevate privileges or to get into another system, don't fix it. That's like fixing a hole in a colander. You know, if you got a little bit bigger hole, fine. You know, you're still letting water come out of it. But being able to understand that and prioritize is really one of the key tenets of taking a risk management approach. So what you see in the risk management approach, if you're thinking, oh, I think this company, I'm going to go look at this organization, I think this is the approach they take. There's some things you see. Number one, you see a corporate-wide emphasis or an enterprise-wide if you're dealing with a government agency or higher ed or a nonprofit. Really an organizational-wide emphasis on controls and on awareness. And so that in particular is a good sign that we're taking a little bit of a risk management approach. Because who is the most risky person to an organization as a group? Easy question.
Trusted insider.
Yes, that's a subset. That is the most risk. It's employees. It's employees. Whether it's someone making a mistake, whether it's a rogue employee or whether it's a compromised credential. You know, there are a lot of different things you can focus on, but I'm a big believer that those forms of insider threat pose the most challenge to most employees. And so some of the insider threat you can train out of people. You don't need tools. The controls are really around better training. And so when you see some of the corporate-wide type initiatives around awareness, some of that is compliance driven in certain industries, but really that's a little bit of a telltale sign. An adoption of a standards-based framework. You guys had any exposure to that? Is that a new term for you? So a framework is like any other kind of framework. It's kind of a blueprint at a high level of what you're going to build, and so very much so on that end. So you see things like the NIST framework in particular is one that gets adopted. There's a method to prioritize prevention, detection, and remediation. And then there's an ecosystem for the architecture around the tooling in particular. So figuring out how the tooling works together, understanding where you have gaps, understanding where you have overlaps. And then funding decisions are based on the framework. What are we going to do in there? And so you might think, well, you got to be a large organization to take that approach. Not necessarily. You have the lions and then you have the honey badgers that are out there. So there are some smaller firms that take this approach. And what they've got to do there, they've got to be real smart about how they invest, not only in tooling, but in human capital. Sometimes they got to have people who wear multiple hats and can be very flexible about what they can do. And sometimes they've got to be very flexible about what they do internally versus what they out-task to another firm. Utilizing a risk management approach can help determine how to make wiser decisions. It takes bias out of decisions oftentimes, personal bias that comes in any different way. I like the salesman. This is my pet project. I wrote the original one of these programs. There's no way we can replace it. So, utilizing frameworks and a risk management approach helps take some of that personal bias out. And then, again, you see some form of a security framework oftentimes adopted. So how is that different from protecting the brand? These are the most valuable brands in 2007. All of them have had a security incident. All of them have had some security incident this month. Some way, shape, or form. Most of them tiny. Some have had well-documented data breaches. Well-documented. Verizon in particular, the company that puts out the report about the state of cybersecurity, had a breach not too long ago. And so there's some irony there, but if you're mature about the thinking, people are going to have incidents and people may have a breach. So what do you do? So given that these are all very powerful brands, many of them you can look at and can think of, they've had a breach. There was an AWS breach last night of a company. I saw that in the news this morning. People are going to quit buying things from Amazon? Nope. If you've ever driven by the distribution center out here on I-26, there are a lot of cars in that parking lot every day of the week, and they've experienced some data breaches, and they're a technology company. So what do they do differently? So protect the brand is very similar to risk management, but the process begins and ends with the impact to the business. Whereas risk management may start at a different point in the process. If you're really worried about protecting the brand, your thoughts around cybersecurity really begin and end with what's the impact to my bottom line, and how is that going to be affected by an incident. So if you see on the left there, it may be easier to see for the people on the WebEx than the folks in the room, but that was the brand equity of Target and Home Depot post their well-publicized data breaches. One looks a little better than the other. There was some benefit in that Target happened before Home Depot, so there's a little bit of a bias in the way that looks. So don't read too much into that. But what I want you to take from that is there is a little bit of a hit that folks get when you have a breach. And so how do they deal with that? One thing is security is a board level or executive level priority, either for the current regime or for their replacements. The CEO at Target, when the breach happened, he's not the CEO at Target anymore. The CEO at Home Depot, when the breach happened, not the CEO at Home Depot anymore. Probably would still have his job if he hadn't publicly said we're in the business of selling hammers, not in the business of cybersecurity. The new CEO has a different message, than that. So what do? How's it different? So you start and begin, you begin that approach at the threat level sometimes if you're taking a risk management approach. And you say, okay, what's my threat? What's the impact of that? And then how do I address it? You really flip that in the protect the brand approach. Really what you're looking there is you're looking at, okay, here's an event, here's the impact of my business. So let's say I'm a retailer, it's during the holidays, my e-commerce site goes down, I lose $1 million every 10 minutes. That's a pretty big impact. As opposed to taking the other approach and saying, okay, here's a DDoS attack, what could it happen, where are we going to be impacted? It really looks at what the impact is first and then comes the other way. And so in that particular e-commerce example, if there's a service disruption, there's real tangible dollars there depending on the business you're in. And that service disruption could be different depending on the industry you're in. If you have a service disruption and you're a hospital these days or a clinic attached to a centralized EMR, you may not be able to see patients if you haven't properly planned for that. So what are some of the things that you base these priorities on? Reputation. You want to protect your reputation. You don't want supply chain disruption. You don't want service disruption to your customers. You want to limit account fraud. You want to limit IP loss. I mean, if you're a very innovative company, the last thing you want is somebody stealing all your IP. That may be what your priority needs to be from a cybersecurity perspective. Guy in the bottom corner of the slide there, Willie Sutton. Any of you know the famous thing that Willie Sutton said? He was asked a question, and his response, you will have heard his response. Somebody asked Willie Sutton, why do you rob banks? What was his answer? Because that's where the money is. So if you're taking a protect the brand approach, you want to think like the bad guy. Where's my money? Is my money in my IP? Is my money in my accounts? Is my money in my supply chain? Is my money in the way that I go to market? So you've got to understand that. And so another big difference, so I showed you that slide of the top 10 brands. They all had incidents. Some of them had data breaches. Here's the difference in them and some other companies. Detection, response, and recovery are part of the process. You are not going to protect yourself 100% against the threats that are out there. So how do you mitigate it? If you've got an issue, how do you prioritize what you work on? How do you have a communication plan to minimize the damage, first and foremost, to your customers, and secondly, to your own reputation? And so a lot of folks take a prevention alone approach, and they build that big castle like you see on Game of Thrones. Well, what's the problem with that? We talked about that earlier. Who's your biggest threat? You're locking the bad people in the castle. And so you've got to figure out a way to do that. So right now, unfortunately, people in Florida, people on the coast down here, they're getting ready for a hurricane. They're not preventing that hurricane. It's coming. It may miss us by a little bit, it may miss us by a lot, but that hurricane's hidden somewhere. And so folks have prepared, what are we going to do when it happens? And so not only looking at how can we keep it from happening, which you need to do, but what are we going to do if it does happen? And how are we going to mitigate that? So that's it. I hope it was helpful to you guys. I certainly enjoyed getting to talk to you. You guys have any questions? There's my contact information. Feel free to reach out.
Okay, how about a round of applause for Charlie? Okay, so I know what happens exactly at 10:30. The books close and the brains turn off for the students in the classroom. I'm going to go ahead and wrap up both here on the webinar and in the classroom. Charlie, thank you again for an excellent presentation, number one. Number two, I'm pretty sure I just wrote about eight things that Charlie said that you guys all heard in class the other day. Risk comes from natural and man-made sources. You need to manage that risk. You need to have strategies to manage that risk. You guys saw Charlie had a heat map up here in his presentation. We had a heat map in our class the other day. We looked at prioritization. We talked about I don't have enough resources to protect everything, so what am I going to protect? Those things are most valuable. We talked about NIST in class the other day. We talked about the NIST framework here in Charlie's presentation. We talked about IP, which stands for, so the business,
Intellectual property.
the business people say IP stands for intellectual property.
It's not internet protocol. I was not saying somebody wants to steal your internet protocol.
The technical guys think IP is internet protocol. And then lastly, Charlie had a picture of the castle, and we talked about that. You can't rely on a single defense. You have to have defense in depth and put in a layered strategy for protecting your resources. So thank you, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and close the webinar for today, and then I will give class instructions and wrap up here as before we get ready to head out. So Ethan, if you can stop the audio, stop the recording, and all of the other pieces. You got to pull the other side. Pull left all the way with the mouse. All right.
You don't say anything bad about me, my boss.